In this section, we will look more deeply into the workings of capitalism, the system that prevails today in the USA and most of the world. Here's a puzzle. In slave and feudal systems, the dominant class can use compulsion, can use force to get producers to provide a surplus to that dominant class. Yet in capitalism, the capitalists cannot legally force workers to do anything in particular. They can give orders, but they can't enforce them if they're refused. How can capitalists get a surplus product produced by workers under those conditions? That is what we're going to look into now more carefully. I'll use a simple model of capitalism, the one I mentioned earlier, in which there are only two groups: capitalists who own the productive enterprises and workers who go to work for them. I'll assume that all workers are identical and are paid the same wage. I'll ignore government and foreign trade. I'm going to use some symbols. I'll use the Greek letter capital Pi for profit, which is traditional in economics. And in this simple model of capitalism, total profit in the economy each year is equal to the total product that's produced, because the capitalists get the revenue from producing and selling the final product, after you subtract the wages that are paid to workers, represented by capital W, and after you subtract the costs of capital goods used up. And we'll use capital D for depreciation of capital goods. Thus, symbolically, we have total profit is equal to the total value of output minus depreciation minus wages. Then I'm introducing the concept of net output, using the letter capital Y for net output, which is simply the total product minus depreciation. Thus, we can write total profit is equal to net output minus wages. So, I'll introduce three more variables. Capital L for the labor hours worked over the course of the year by all the workers in the economy. Lowercase y is net output per labor hour. You divide the total output value by the total labor hours. And lowercase w is the wage per hour. It is the total wages paid divided by the number of labor hours. Then, using those symbols, the profit per labor hour worked is equal to dividing this side by labor, and so it's total output per unit labor minus total wages per unit labor, which is net output per labor hour, lowercase y, minus the hourly wage rate. Or multiplying both sides by the labor, the total profit is equal to the difference between net output and wages times the labor hours worked. So, reproducing, these are the definitions of the variables. This is the final result. What does this tell us? It tells us that profit is determined by the relation among three variables. First, net output, and that in turn is determined partly by technology. Technology, how effective the technology is a major determinant of how much output is produced per labor hour on average, but also by power relations, because if the capitalists can get the workers to work harder and faster, they'll get more output per labor hour. Secondly, the wage per hour is also determined by more than one factor. There's human biology. The wage has to be enough to enable workers to survive over time, but it is typically more than mere survival, and where the wage per hour settles, whether it's high or low, is mainly a reflection of power relations. Who has more bargaining power, employers or workers? And third, the total labor performed is determined partly by power relations. The employers would like longer work days and to put on a lot of shifts, and Partly, however, there is custom. Of course, in reality, the government may play a role, but we're assuming no government here. So the point is, profit is the difference between net output and the hourly wage times labor, and those are in turn determined by the way in which technology and power relations, mainly, the way they work out in practice. So, what can we say? Capitalists get profit because they have sufficient power over labor and sufficient control over technology to keep net output greater than the wage. If the wage goes up, they can make sure, that is, the capitalist can make sure that net output goes up too. Note that the amount of profit is also affected by the capitalist's ability to get the maximum amount of hours worked per week or per year. Now, what is the source of the power of capitalists in a capitalist system to achieve these ends? Well, the capitalists own the means of production. That gives them leverage over workers. If workers want to survive, they have to find some capitalist that will hire them. If there's a dispute over wages, as there typically is, the capitalists are rich. And if in a battle between the two sides over the wages, over the level of wages, whether they'll be high or low, capitalists have an advantage that if the workers, say, go out on strike, capitalists are rich, they can survive more easily than workers. Third, and this is a crucial point that I need to emphasize, there is normally a significant amount of unemployment in capitalism. And that has an impact because in the bargaining relationship between workers and employers, the existence of unemployment gives the employers an advantage. As long as there's significant unemployment, workers are going to worry about keeping their job, and they'll tend to want to do what they're told and not complain too much about their wages. If there were no unemployment, then workers would really have an advantage. There are alternatives to unemployment to secure profit for capitalists. While the existence of unemployment is an important factor that enables capitalists to keep wages low enough and keep labor working hard enough and keep technology advancing enough to make a profit, there are other means. In some cases, the government, which we've left out till now, represses labor unions or imposes wage controls that assures capitalist profit. In authoritarian capitalist states, this can happen, and even in our country, the government recently has not been friendly to labor unions. During World War II, there were wage controls. The government set upper limits on wages. Another means of securing profits is what's known as capital-labor compromise. This occurs when employers and workers' organizations agree about the rate of wage increases in a way that will be viewed both as acceptable to workers and acceptable to employers. Now, this explanation of where profit comes from in capitalism is the explanation offered by the political economy approach. Mainstream neoclassical economics does offer different explanations for the origin of profit, based on some kind of payment to capitalists for providing a service in production. I do not have time to go into this here, but you will find it in some of the other course resources. What is the surplus used for under capitalism? One of the questions I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture was an important one. Well, the capitalist consumption, their purchases of food, clothing, yachts, mansions, etc., comes out of the surplus. Second, the surplus goes to build various kinds of monuments, churches, shrines, etc. Third, again, introducing government, some government functions are supported out of the surplus. The military, the police. But something very important about capitalism, a major part of the surplus goes into investment. That is, uses that will increase the quantity and quality of output in the future. The use of surplus for investment, which is also called capital accumulation, is a key feature of capitalism. It's called capital accumulation because the investment process over time leads the value of the capital to increase. Specifically, capital accumulation is the use of some of the surplus product or profit to increase the quantity or quality of output in the future by, first of all, producing more capital goods than are used up in production, by developing new and better technologies, methods of production, by developing new and better products, and used to hire a larger number of workers. All of these activities are part of capital accumulation because they increase the value of the capital owned by the capitalists. Here we have a famous quote: "A key feature of capitalism is its powerful drive to accumulate capital, leading to growing output over time." This quote says, "The bourgeoisie," which is the French word for capitalist, the social scientists always like to use French words when they can, it's more prestigious. "The bourgeoisie has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years," this is an old quote, "has created more massive and colossal productive forces than have all the preceding generations together." Now, you might think this quote comes from Forbes magazine or the Wall Street Journal. It actually is from the Communist Manifesto. Marx was a careful student of capitalism and discovered many important things about its virtues as well as its flaws. Why does capitalism have this powerful accumulation drive? Well, first of all, capitalists want to become richer. If they increase the value of their capital, that's their wealth. They become richer. However, that's not the most important reason for capital accumulation, which does not depend on the greed of individual capitalists. Accumulation is necessary to win the battle of competition. A capitalist who decided that she or he was rich enough and did not accumulate further would be in danger of becoming an ex-capitalist, because the others who did accumulate would be able to drive that one out of business. These same factors, the pressure of competition, explains the profit maximization drive itself. A capitalist who does not single-mindedly pursue profits is in danger of being driven out of business, because profit is necessary for accumulation, which is necessary for survival. There are other consequences of the accumulation drive besides the profit drive and accumulation drive, besides an increasing level of output over time. There is, first of all, a tendency to intensify and prolong labor to gain greater profit and greater ability to accumulate. There is always an effort on the part of capitalists to reduce wages if possible, because that will increase profit. The sales effort that we know so well today in modern capitalism, the commercialization of society, is a product of the pursuit of profit and accumulation. Mergers and acquisitions, the combining together of companies into still larger companies, is a product of this drive. What is called speculative investments, that is, the use of surplus not to engage in real accumulation and real increase in output, but buying and selling existing things, hoping to make a profit when its price increases, is also an outcome of this. Taking into account geography, the profit and accumulation drive leads to expansion of capitalist economic activity across national boundaries, something we will look into in a later lecture. And finally, capitalism has a tendency to expand and gradually erode out of existence other economic systems. The last topic I'll take up today related to the basic functioning of capitalism is the phenomenon of economic crises. An economic crisis is an interruption, a stoppage of the accumulation process in which output stagnates or declines for the whole economy. During an economic crisis, the usual accumulation drive of capitalism stops working normally. Economic crises are a specific phenomenon of the capitalist economic system. This shows symbolically the business cycle, the ups and downs in the economy. Here we have a peak when accumulation is normal, then a crisis occurs and the economy heads downhill into what's called the trough, the bottom of the business cycle. Then eventually normal accumulation begins again and heads to a peak. So there's an up and down motion, but in the long run, there is a growth trend in capitalism. Now, why do economic crises happen in capitalism? The key factor in economic crisis is the rate of profit in the economy, which refers to how big are profits compared to the capital of the capitalists. If the rate of profit rises, capitalists are encouraged to expand. If the rate of profit falls, even though it's still positive, capitalists are likely to wait until it improves. And so they stop investing and the economy heads into a recession, which is a term for an economic crisis that lasts a relatively short period of time. Now, we recognize two different kinds of economic crisis, short run and long run. A short run crisis, as I just indicated, is often called a business cycle recession. This type of crisis typically lasts 6 months to 2 years, during which the gross domestic product, the total output of the economy, declines. The normal working of a capitalist economy will eventually end this type of crisis. The second type of crisis is known as a long-run crisis, sometimes called a structural crisis. This type of crisis is a period of many years in which the growth of total output, GDP, and profits are below the normal levels, and unemployment is high over the longer run. A long-run crisis is not resolved by the working of a capitalist economy. Resolving a long-run crisis and reestablishing normal expansion requires changes in the structure of capitalism. That is, changes in institutions and class relationships. That's why it's called a structural crisis. There are three main causes of a crisis in the political economy literature, three main causes that are discussed in that literature: underconsumption, the profit squeeze, and overinvestment. I'll explain each briefly. Underconsumption. This occurs when capitalists have a lot of power over workers. The high degree of capitalist power leads to wages stagnating or even falling while profits keep rising. So that encourages the capitalists to keep expanding. However, it causes a problem. Who will buy the rising amount of goods being produced by an expanding economy if wages are declining, or even just if they're not increasing? A growing economy requires growing consumption. As a result, a shortage of demand emerges. There's not enough demand for all the goods and services being produced. Unable to sell all that they produce, capitalists cut back on production and lay off workers. Thus, this type of crisis cause involves as its underlying explanation that capitalists are too strong in class struggle with workers. The second possible cause of crisis is known as the profit squeeze. If the economy expands rapidly enough and long enough, eventually all the available workers will get jobs. There will be no more unemployment. With no or even just very low unemployment, workers' bargaining power increases. They realize they can demand higher wages because they can't be replaced easily. As a result, wages begin to rise fast enough to reduce profits, The capitalists lose the ability to keep net output per worker ahead of the wage. That is, capitalists are squeezed. Capitalist profits are squeezed by rising wages. And capitalists respond to this falling profit by reducing production and laying off workers, waiting until conditions improve. This type of crisis, the underlying cause is that workers are too strong for capitalists to obtain the normal rate of profit, rather than too weak, as in the case of underconsumption. The third possible cause of a crisis is known as overinvestment. As capitalists accumulate, as they expand, they increase the amount of fixed capital. Fixed capital refers to capital goods that last a long time, machines, factory and office buildings, as distinguished from, say, the steel that is used by the auto industry that's simply used up quickly in production. If they accumulate too fast, capitalists can put in place too much fixed capital relative to total demand for output, because they're never sure how great their output demand will be. As a result, the capitalists find they cannot use all of their productive capacity that exists in the amount of machines they have, the size of the buildings they have, and the capitalists respond to this overcapacity by reducing investment. Why should they invest and increase their capital goods, their fixed capital, if they've already got too much? So they reduce investment and production, they lay off workers. The underlying cause in this case is the unplanned nature of capitalism, that capitalists cannot know how much they'll be able to sell in the future when their investments bring fruit. Economic crises are costly, even the short-run ones. Increased unemployment hurts workers, something we'll look into more in a later section. It's not just workers that are hurt. Smaller firms go bankrupt, and this hurts capitalists and independent producers, small producers, who may have been perfectly efficient, but they can't survive the recession. It is inefficient to have at the same time unemployed workers, unused productive capacity, and unmet needs that occurs in a crisis. Then there is a decline in tax revenues as incomes fall, and that leads to cutbacks in essential public programs and services. Finally, a long-run crisis can have severe political consequences, conflicts, repression, even war.